Hey everyone, welcome to this presentation. I tell people that I usually give this in somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours, so let's see how this one goes. Let's start with China's history a little bit, for those who aren't familiar. So this is a photo of a young Chinese girl holding the same amount of yuan that represented 10 US dollars at the time. And this was 444,000 Chinese currency units at the time. This was during the nationalist period of government. Immediately afterwards, the Communist Party and Mao Zedong took over. And so we can understand the effect that inflation has had on China, even just through this story, but throughout history as well. So, unfortunately the slides are a little bit graphic, but for those who know about this is the Cultural Revolution. And so Mao Zedong, as part of the Cultural Revolution, tried to set the terms of his succession. And the leaders who took over from him ended up trying to change China into a China now that we recognize more and more. People always ask me, is China capitalist? Is China communist? Is China socialist? There's like a lot of confusion about that. And that confusion starts because when Mao died, the Chinese leaders who took over were of a new generation that believed in private markets. They liberalized, for example, employment. So you could have companies of more than 5 people. But they still believed in the firm political control of the Chinese Party state. And I call it the Chinese Party state because the Chinese Communist Party is embedded in the state itself. It is a totalitarian state where the party controls everything. The roots of that dynamic, though, and we see here, so before was the Cultural Revolution. I try to put that up with Tiananmen Square, which happened about 10 years later. And so in between those 10 years, China became much more economically free in the sense of you could earn money without being punished, without being killed as a landlord. There's a capitalist rotor, 走资派, as they call it in Mandarin. But still, there was not the ability to have political freedoms. There was not the ability to have freedom of press. And the Chinese leadership, Hu Yaobang, who is represented here, that tried to give China both political freedom and economic freedom, he said something incredibly based, which is that China could learn nothing from Mao Zedong. So props to him. But he died, and unfortunately that is what caused the Tiananmen Square protests. And the China that we know today is a Chinese Communist Party that has learned their lesson from that and has taken it to mean that there needs to be free enterprise to some degree, but firm political control over the people. So we started all this, and I gave you all like a quick, maybe primer on Chinese history for 3 or 4 minutes, and you might be like, well, what does that all have to do with Bitcoin? And the first thing I always say to people is that the Chinese people are so fascinated by Bitcoin. There are so many entrepreneurs. If you think about the miners, the mining companies, right? If you think about Bitmain that provided the first kind of specialized chips to mine Bitcoin. And even if you go to any conference, you can see people who are either miners, entrepreneurs, or people who are just interested in Bitcoin who are Chinese, right? And that's such a wonderful thing to see. But it starts with understanding why China is the way it is right now. Because, in a China that it's glorious to get rich, where it doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat as long as it hunts mice. This is a China now where one of the biggest cardinal values is the ability to be able to make money and spend money. And I have to say, it's why Bitcoin gets right to the heart of the Chinese Communist Party's greatest fears, which is that Chinese people can make money, but also freely choose where to spend money and freely choose to take money outside of the borders. But in order for you to understand why Chinese people are so interested in Bitcoin and why the Chinese party state and government are so terrified of Bitcoin, you have to understand that piece of history of how China now, and the China of today, is different from Mao's China in the sense of economic liberty to some degree, but is not different in terms of political control. So I talk a little bit, everybody's second question about China and Bitcoin is always like, well, I've heard that China has banned Bitcoin like 20 or 30 times or whatever. Like you have all the memes like, how many more times can China ban Bitcoin? There are more times, trust me. There is more to ban. But part of the reason why, and I try to explain this to people, is like, first it's reinforcement of the fact that Bitcoin is kind of, well, not kind of, but like, is very hard or almost impossible to ban in that way, right? I get into it in more detail in several articles that I've written, but the short of it is that there is not really a way, us Bitcoiners, we know, like of trading peer-to-peer, of being able to control your own private key, of being able to go around borders with just a few words in your head. So in that sense, already the Chinese party state has failed in its ability to be able to ban it. But what does it mean for the Chinese party state to be able to ban certain parts of Bitcoin? So I kind of talked through a couple of different things. So it starts with, in 2013, the Chinese party state has filed regulatory notices and said things like, hey, like Chinese banks can't use Bitcoin. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, Bitcoin is designed for that in the first place, right? So, but I want to say that early on in China's history and engagement with Bitcoin, Baidu, which is China's Google, was actually one of the first companies in the world to accept Bitcoin. It accepted Bitcoin for its cloud computing services. But as soon as the Chinese party state and the government started to put in these regulatory notices and bans, that is when companies and entrepreneurs in China kind of got the message that the government was fearful of it, and there was less and less kind of support on that side. But in terms of Bitcoin, it doesn't really matter, right? The other thing that happens, there's these things called KOLs, and those are key opinion leaders. It's what you call influencers or creators in North America. I'm not too sure what the name is in Brazil, but yeah, just people who are creating a ton of content online. And so, you know, China's one of the easiest things China can do is ban certain accounts for either posting certain hashtags or for, you know, posting certain content. So that's what happens with Tiananmen Square content, for example. You know, if you're trying to post the date of Tiananmen Square, you know, that will get taken down or you will get banned and all these other things. They did that with Bitcoiners, but that, of course, doesn't really matter. I mean, no offense to Bitcoin Twitter, but you could, of which many members of you may be in the room, but like all of Bitcoin Twitter could be shut down, and that's not going to stop Bitcoin from publishing more and more blocks, right? Then there was the exchanges ban. So you got to give the Chinese party state some credit. They are very smart at banning technologies. They are what I call the perfect red team for Bitcoin. And what that means in a cybersecurity term is a very advanced enemy and someone that does things in order to restrict the use of Bitcoin in a way that an intelligent kind of countermaneuver would do. So they realized most people onboard and offboard on exchanges. So one of the first things they did was to tell exchanges that were based in China that they could no longer be based there. OKX, Huobi, and other places. And they could no longer serve people with Chinese addresses. Then there was, of course, the mining ban, which we'll talk about a little bit more. There's a lot of nuance there. I don't know if I can get through that in 30 minutes, but they basically discouraged miners and a lot of people migrated out. And that might have killed Bitcoin in the sense of like China had a lot of physical hash rate at the time. But what we've since proven since then is that Bitcoin is stronger than ever and the Chinese party state is more confused than they've ever been. And unfortunately in 2021 they also did make it illegal to trade Bitcoin and Tether for yuan, and there have been a few thousand people arrested. There are some other crimes in conjunction with that, but in general, if you are trading yuan for Tether or for Bitcoin, law enforcement can get involved now. So why don't we talk a little bit about the Chinese surveillance state? Some of you might know this, but China is one of the most advanced surveillance states in the world. It has one CCTV camera for every 2 people. I think the United Kingdom is the only country that comes close to that. You know, this is a very advanced system. There's all these kind of different things out there. For example, if you're jaywalking and stuff like that, they'll have this thing that says like, hey, you individual one should not be jaywalking in this way. So very, very creepy. And when there have been physical protests, like for example, the zero COVID moments, this is how they do catch everybody who is protesting, even if they wear masks and things like that. There's, of course, control of mobile infrastructure. I think this might be a live debate, maybe in Brazil and other places, but China is trying to set standards for mobile infrastructure. China now is a place where even it's dangerous, it can be dangerous to download Signal and Telegram because the SMS verification is under tight control from the Chinese telecom providers, and you have to put down a real ID in order to register a domestic SIM. So the government can find out who you are through that. These are all things to watch out for and things that Freedomtech proponents need to be aware of. Again, I go back to China being the most advanced red team in this regard, the most advanced surveillance state. And then lastly, there's also, I mean, people ask me a lot about the social credit score. Not going to be able to go into like a huge amount of detail on this, but there's a great resource on this called China Law Translate that I always suggest to people. He's this Yale law professor who has translated a lot of the original Mandarin documents. The short of it is that the Chinese party state is trying to combine all these pieces of data, including the central bank digital currency, the digital yuan that it has advanced, and trying to piece together a way to control, surveil, and monitor people across many dimensions. Now in China, for example, you have to have your data stored in Chinese servers. This includes genetic data, this includes all kinds of other data profiles. The open question is how much this is combined into individual level scores and how much people are punished or penalized. But there definitely have been penalties associated for your online activity. For example, people have been arrested for tweeting to 50 people, "Glory to Hong Kong." Or there have been people who have been in clubhouse rooms and things like that and been asked to talk with the local police because of their offline activity. This is dystopian, but I also want to remind people that just because it's happening in China, it's not that it's China specific. It's, every government is trying to do some version of this, and a lot of them are trying to look to China even if they don't talk about it openly. So what's the counterfactual to that? What's the resilience? How can we look to resistance to that? We've been talking a lot about the despair part. Wow, this is such a powerful enemy. But, in cybersecurity, there's also the blue team, the hero team, right? And, obviously, I'm not up here wearing like a Chinese Communist Party hat. I'm wearing like a Bitcoin propaganda department. So I guess you can kind of tell what team or how I think of in terms of teams of where I'm at. But you see these signs of resilience. And this is like the most cool thing I've seen when it comes to the cypherpunk community and Bitcoin community. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased because I was born in China, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to go through the digital firewalls that surround the Chinese people, the Chinese diaspora, and everything else. And I want to say that if you go on Nostr, and I'm going to share some MPubs of some people who are Chinese cypherpunks who are posting, you can find this discourse. You can find people teaching each other techniques to get across the Chinese firewall and to use Freedomtech and technology like that. So this is a really big point of resilience for me. Chinese people still continue to buy Bitcoin, and there's record demand for it. It's illegal to buy Bitcoin with yuan and renminbi, so you can't really see public pairings of this. But the quantitative and qualitative data, I'm looking forward to be able to release more qualitative data, but quantitative data shows that Chinese-based over-the-counter trading desks, which is where most people will buy Bitcoin. These are these kind of like private, more like private banking institutions. I mean, for people not familiar with over-the-counter trading desks, usually the way it works in China is they're usually a subsidiary of the traditional Chinese exchanges. For example, Binance, OKX, or Huobi, that allow you to discover these merchants that are willing to trade Tether or Bitcoin for you in order for yuan deposits. It's actually kind of cool. I was interviewing someone about the experience, and they have these kind of sketchy local bank accounts, and you kind of wire them money, and they'll just send you back Bitcoin. And if they don't, then you can go after Binance, and then Binance can go tell the Chinese party state hey, we're not responsible for any of this illegal activity. We're just a discoverability system. We don't sell yuan, Tether or Bitcoin for yuan. So that's kind of the gray zone area. From what we can see from those OTC desks, trading volume is at near all-time highs. 2021, which is kind of when the bans happened, there was a decrease in volume, but now we see partially because the Chinese economy is doing really badly, but partially because Bitcoin has been so globally resilient and such a great source of return. We are seeing continued and increasing demand for Bitcoin, a sign of resilience. For people in China, this is a lifeline because in China, you are not allowed to export your money at will. There is a restriction of 50,000 USD a person a year for taking your money out of the system. And so if you're Chinese and you earn money your whole life, you might have only a few choices, Chinese shares and real estate. And both of those are going down catastrophically. I've been asking some people, I'm like, how's your Chinese stock portfolio going, right? They're like, I lost 60% like, of my net worth. And I don't even want to say the second part, which is just like, well, if you put that amount in Bitcoin, you would have 4x'd your net worth, right? Like, just adding salt to the wound, but it's kind of implied. But yeah, Chinese real estate is also going down right now. So in Shenzhen, in housing, 30% down. Youth unemployment is at record highs. They don't even publish the statistics anymore. I don't even really know if the stats are accurate. Don't ask me. But they stopped even publishing the youth unemployment stats. That's how bad it's gotten. Bitcoin miners kind of went around the world, and the hash rate is global. And one thing I can tell you all, and I guess this camera and whoever is recording, I'm going to be publishing an article about this, but there was continued Bitcoin mining in China, and there continues to be Bitcoin miners who still mine in China. And I think that shows you just like the resilience of the network. Even you have like a country where they had a province, Inner Mongolia, that had a hotline, it had a snitch line. You would be like, hey, my neighbor's mining Bitcoin. Like, you gotta go arrest this guy, right? And that, it was a real thing. Like there were, yeah, like people did leave China. I would have left too, for that to happen. But there were still people who still mined Bitcoin. And there are, even people in the party. One of the funnest stories I give is like there's a senior party official, actually from my hometown, shout out, Fuzhou. He got arrested for still promoting Bitcoin mining even after the Chinese Communist Party, the National Party, was against it. So there's embrace of Freedomtech, and there's Chinese entrepreneurs and VCs and Chinese buyers of Bitcoin all over the world. I think I'm doing okay. Maybe not. The current state. I don't know how much I can go through this. But basically, some of the stuff we talked about, there's a trading ban, but people are still buying with over-the-counter. Some significant mining still remains, but I think it's mostly local governments. People always ask me, like, is China the country going to, like, the national government going to change its opinion? And I think you're going to see a lot of people, like, there's a vice minister of finance, a Hong Kong professor that said the Bitcoin mining bans were probably a mistake. And you're probably going to see more and more statements like that, either from former officials or maybe even a current official in China. But I don't think that the National Party is going to change its stance on Bitcoin mining. But there are local governments, I think, that are encouraging it. And there's Tether trade. Most people do trade in Tether. The spread's a little bit lower. But I think there's a lot of hope in that because in China, the ability to be able to get your money out in a positive returning asset is like the most important way to subvert the state, I guess you can say. And China's still a very large part of the Bitcoin economy. And if any of you speak Mandarin, like go on the X Spaces. You can listen to it live. Like people like live stream. They're just like, hey, I'm gonna go gamble today on like whatever token. There's a lot of shitcoinery that happens, but it is what it is. So. Here we come to a slide where I try to summarize 4 complex trends in 2 minutes. So for those who don't know, in the first slide, I mean, people know the second guy, right? Xi Jinping, hopefully, yes. Yes. The first guy is actually, I always say, he's like the underrated Bitcoin boss. Like, you know how like in a video game, maybe not the final boss, but like he's kind of like a boss. So that's Liu He, who was part of the Xi's Politburo. So Xi has never personally commented on Bitcoin, but Liu He is the one who said in 2021 that Bitcoin mining is harmful to the whole of Chinese society. So he is the one who kickstarted the Bitcoin mining ban. He is the one who kickstarted law enforcement getting involved and other things. But then you might ask me, well, what's going on with Hong Kong? Because I've heard like in Hong Kong there's a spot Bitcoin ETF, but there were protests and things like that. And the answer to that is that Hong Kong is still separated from the mainland in a technical sense. There's this thing called one country, two systems. Macau is also the same way. That might resonate with more people. But basically, there is still a separate chief executive of Hong Kong. They did implement a national security law, and like I said yesterday, and I'll repeat again, free Jimmy Lai, free the Hong Kong 47, who were unjustly imprisoned for running primaries and trying to run a democratic process. But they're not at the point where they're trying to ban Bitcoin. But what they are trying to do in Hong Kong is to regulate it more tightly. I encourage any of you, when you're going to Hong Kong, there's a ton of over-the-counter trading counters, physical cash shops. They take Lightning. I don't know how long that's going to last, but as of now, they will take your Lightning and they will give you back Hong Kong dollars in massive amounts. And lastly, I think the most significant response the Chinese Party State has had to Bitcoin has been the digital yuan. So I showed, this is 数字人民币, which means digital yuan. And that's kind of like a preview of what the app looks like. Honestly, sometimes I have enough time to go through the app, but like it's just basically like, let me see if my next slide. Yeah, like the ECNY basically works really similar to like, I guess Pix, if I'm in Brazil. I'm going to use that as an example. Pix? Oh, Drex. Okay, so yeah, it would be similar to digital real. Yeah. The ECNY is not bank money. It is directly issued from the central bank. And so it's different from Pix, but I mean in terms of the user interface. Like the user interface is like, it's pretty similar to any digital payment solution. It's like QR codes, you put your money in. The digital yuan has not been very successful. In total, it has processed $1 trillion in volume. However, it is very, just for frame of reference, Bitcoin processed about like 2.2 trillion in 2022. And the Chinese Party State has been trying to advance the digital yuan as much as possible. And it, along with other central banks, such as the Saudi Central Bank and others, have created this project called Project M-Bridge. So they are trying to create standards for central bank digital currencies. So like the Drex that you're mentioning and other places, I think other countries are trying to learn from the Chinese experience. China says it's a pilot. It's not a pilot. It's used in metro stations and other places. But one of the reasons why they call it a pilot is because they're ashamed to admit it's not popular. It's just like not popular. Like people don't want to use it. So far, I've heard it's mostly businesses that use it. But individuals, they are interviewed about this and they're like, why should I bother downloading this other app? But even though it hasn't been that successful, I think the digital yuan is something to be wary of. And just to give you an example, first, everything on there is surveilled and monitored. This is a consequence of a cashless society that is then able to be put on a database. And though it doesn't offer interest rate, the money in the case of the trials was expired. So they literally were like, you have this amount of digital yuan. If you don't spend it in 2 weeks, we're going to take it away from you. I don't know about you, but like, I'm not signing up for a thing that's like, hey, here's your money system, but by the way, the government can take away your money at any time. Food for thought. Yeah, this is like a hardware format of it. Sometimes I have time to go through it, but in general, it just they have smart cards as well. So just some key numbers for it. It's in 29 cities and regions, including some of China's largest. It's in Beijing, it's in Shanghai. The $14 billion in cumulative usage is a little bit of an old stat. Like I said, it's about $1 trillion. One thing is that the digital yuan is not in a public ledger, and the central bank chose all of the vendors, right? I think that's kind of a failure point. When the central banks implement CBDC, and that's something we as Bitcoiners can learn, they are going to fail at two things. One is merchant adoption. Like, it's just really, really hard. It's also really hard for like people to do Lightning with merchant adoption, to be fair as well. But like in a central bank, they really, really struggle with that. So in China, for example, they've never really gotten the 10x more merchants that are on WeChat Pay and Alipay. They can get the payment platforms because they can use of force, but they can't force individual people and individual mom and pop shops that are the foundation of an economy to download this new app. The other thing about something like this that is that we should learn from is that when a central bank digital currency is implemented, they are going to fail from a technical perspective I think, as well. Because the central bank is going to choose its own vendors. And this is a government, every government has in its story like this, but China's Shanghai police database had one of the largest leaks ever. And so you have the worst of both worlds. You have no privacy from the government and possibly from other players, maximum surveillance. And I believe that by embracing open source innovation and our community of global kind of builders, Bitcoin will win. This is just an idea of like how the privacy tiers. The basic point is that it's not private. Like you need to put down a phone number in order to access the system at any reasonable level. That can be tied to your real ID in China. So we get to the coolest part with 4 minutes left. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Chinese cypherpunks that are on Nostr. There's not a ton of them, so I don't want to pretend that there's like many. But every time I see one, it's really cool. This guy's basically saying that like Web3 is bullshit and crypto is a grand casino. Yeah, I think I did like the Google Translate. I just pulled some quotes from like Mandarin Nostr. So I did this thing where I took every Mandarin, I took a bunch of, I think it was like 1 million notes from like different relays, and I filtered down to a bunch of them in Mandarin just to get a sense of like what were people posting in Mandarin on Nostr. And it's been really cool to see because they're just like us, but in China. So I think this is Miami Coin. I think Francis Suarez or like whatever. But anyways, talking about altcoins, and then China's M2. So that's a big stat for Chinese people to track because the money supply is very banked in China. China has structurally one of the highest savings rates in the world, and so again, like these discussions are happening live in mainland China, and thankfully for Nostr. So got to give a shout out because Fiat Jeff is from Brazil, so it's just a magical thing to see this kind of like spread of Freedomtech. If you guys want to take some photos, because I don't want to stay too long on this, but like these are some MPubs that are active, and you all, and I'm comfortable with this because a bunch of them have been on podcasts and things like that. And one of the coolest things about Chinese people on Nostr is one of them is actually, well, he's not in China, he's in Malaysia, but they have like Michael Wong on there, and he's like pretty active. He's like kind of a king of Mando Pop. So imagine if like, I don't know what the Brazilian equivalent is, but like Justin Bieber was like on Nostr and was like super shilling Bitcoin. That's kind of what's happening. So people probably don't know this, but like, yeah, there are like celebrities that are on there from like the Chinese ecosystem. And then there's like people who share privacy tech tips. There's this guy, Agan, who's like Forrest Gump. He's kind of got, and so what I normally say is like, for people, we have such a wonderful tool, a client that allows you to translate posts from around the world. You can go and find these people, find who's following them, following back, and hopefully they follow you, and you can have conversations and things like that. So anyways. So what's the future going to be like? And let me just check to see that's the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide. Woo! We did it. 30 minutes. So thank you. People ask me about the future, which might actually be the most important question for you all, and which I have the least amount of time to talk about. But in general, I think you're going to see a lot of positive statements about Bitcoin because China does track the US president, and they are looking at what Trump is saying. I don't think there's going to be an unban. I think the whole idea of like restricting Bitcoin, but also embracing the digital yuan. Also, Xi Jinping has done an unprecedented thing. He's likely to be the Chinese president for until 2029, and then God knows until when else. But so I don't think that's going to change. But Hong Kong is trying to position itself as kind of like a digital assets hub. They're very Web3 focused. But buyer beware, I have heard that it's very difficult to actually start anything in Hong Kong. Like if you try to get banked as a quote unquote crypto business or as a Bitcoin cash shop, and they are trying to regulate out Bitcoin cash shops, you will find it very difficult. Just like I talked about, China's economy is doing really badly. And that will do two things. One, the Chinese central bank will do more stimulus, which will be bullish for Bitcoin. And secondly, since China's economy is doing badly, Chinese people are going to be looking for solutions outside of China, and that is also bullish for Bitcoin. So even if there might be no unban, a lot of bullish things. And then lastly, I left with the note of war versus peace. If China invades Taiwan, I don't know what's going to happen. So I'll leave on that note.